What would happen if we tutored every child in America for their entire education? Tutoring has always been the gold standard in education. From ancient China and Mesoamerica to ancient Egypt and Rome, tutoring has always been something expensive and unaffordable for all but the elite in a society. But times have changed. The average American today, for example, is hundreds of times wealthier than the average Roman of ancient times. Basically, we're all the Roman elite, and we could now afford to tutor every single child for their entire public education if that was our priority. But what would happen if we did that? In this video, we're going to explore this question. What would happen if we treated every child in the USA like an elite member of a historical civilization? This is kids learning in a classroom. But actually, studies have shown that a lot of these kids aren't learning very well. Most people don't learn that well in classrooms. We know this because when we compare how kids learn when they only learn something in a classroom to when they only learn the same things from tutoring, meaning one teacher teaching no more than 3 students at a time, we find that the kids who are tutored are actually all fantastic at learning. A lot of them just don't learn well in classrooms. The reasons for this difference are not well understood, but what is indisputable is that there is a big difference.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
Tutoring's unlike most educational approaches in that we have a lot of good research on its effectiveness.
It would be really hard to find an educational intervention that has the same rigorous research base and potential to improve student outcomes as tutoring does.
In fact, the difference is so vast that only the top 2% of children learning in a classroom can keep up with the average student who is tutored. The ineffectiveness of classroom learning could very well explain why, in the modern era of universal schooling, there's still so much mediocre learning. For argument's sake, let's just assume that the research we have so far is correct. What would happen if we tutored all the kids full-time? Setting aside the obvious questions like money and the number of tutors we need, what would happen if we tutored every child and, in a distant future, everybody grew up to become what we now consider to be a highly educated person? Imagine a world where the average person is as smart as the smartest 2% of people are today. That means the average person can succeed in pretty much any academic or career path they might choose. Amazing, right? Or, is there such thing as being too smart? Is there a problem if we produce too many people with elite level intelligence? There are some scholars who use a term called elite overproduction, and it refers to the dangers of overeducating a population. Some say that's what destroyed the Russian Empire and the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire. And it's become an increasingly popular way to describe what's happening in the United States right now and why the US is becoming less stable and less democratic. If we tutored all the kids and made people too smart, would we just be throwing more fuel into a dumpster fire? Maybe we need to keep a majority of the people ignorant for society to function properly. Or maybe it would be really good. Maybe society would become more enlightened and get better if we all got smarter. There are answers. This is not an unanswerable question. I once had a second grade student named Kevin who was growing up in a very high poverty neighborhood. He came to school early one morning before any of the other students got there. And while we were reading a book together, he said, "Don't you wish it was just us today?" And in fact, I did. Because whenever I tutored him before or after school, he was a completely different child compared to who he was in class. In class, he was famous throughout the school for being a troublemaker. He was making me hate my job. He didn't care about my rules. He was more into chaos and getting attention. But for whatever reason, when I tutored him, he just wasn't. He learned quickly. He paid attention. He was well behaved. He didn't mind working hard, and actually he was helpful. Did things like sharpen my pencils. He was just a good student, but again, only when he was being tutored. So he and I were on the same page about what would have been better for him and for me. And as you heard, the scientists agree with us too. The research says tutoring works, and it's not really controversial. But still, there was a problem with Kevin's longing to be tutored all day, which is that it's completely bananas. It's unrealistic. What are you going to do with all the other kids? That is absurd. But that absurdity And the ridiculousness of his requests is actually a helpful clue here. As we try to answer this question, what would happen if we gave every child the right to be tutored? It's very useful to remember that this is absurd and ridiculous. That's because absurd and ridiculous things have been happening in public education for centuries. And studying those past ridiculous moments can give us insights into what would happen if we did something ridiculous again. Something ludicrous happened to public education in the US in the 19th century. You see, in the 18th century, on average, English boys and their colonial counterparts in America spent less than 2 years of their lives in school. Rich white boys got the most, non-white people, girls, poor people did not get much schooling at all. So picture a young peasant boy in the early 18th century saying, "It sure would be nice if I could go to school until 8th grade, and if the government would pay for my education so my parents don't have to." How ridiculous and absurd would that child have sounded to them at that time? The idea that every child, even the lowest status kids, should go to a public, free primary school paid for by the community instead of the parents was completely out of this world. But slowly, the ridiculous thing did happen, and faster in the USA than anywhere else. Public, community-funded primary education took off. It was called the Common Schools Movement, and by 1870, after the Civil War ended slavery, over 90% of American children were enrolled in public primary school, more than any other country in the world at that time. Between 1800 and 1860, the average number of years that Americans spent in school rose from about 1.5 years to 7 years. Literacy rates exploded, especially among women and non-white people, who were the least likely to be educated in colonial America. Better educated Americans exploded into adulthood. And to give you an idea of how ridiculous the USA was at this time, in Russia in the year 1900, less than 15% of the kids were enrolled in primary school. And in China, it was less than 10%. Meanwhile, in the USA in the year 1900, 97% of kids went to primary school. In both Russia and China, the opinion of the elites was that overeducating people would upset the natural order of society. And so, Imperial China and Tsarist Russia were champions of this idea that keeping people ignorant was the best way to preserve the social order. High levels of illiteracy were important, and the USA was playing with fire by overeducating its people. Was overeducating people bad for America? Or was it scarier to keep the population undereducated? We'll come back to that question because this is not the end of the story of American educational ridiculousness. Most of us have forgotten that in 1870, universal high school was still completely ridiculous everywhere in the world, including the USA. In 1870, 1.4% of Americans had a high school degree. Historically, high school had always been for the upper crust. Most people didn't even want to go to high school. What would be the point? It was a weird person or a rich person who got a high school degree. High schools were few and far between. So again, picture this. In 1870, a young boy whose parents aren't rich or white asks that a new high school be built near his home. Oh, and it should be tuition free and have no entrance exam to get in. And while you're at it, do that for everyone else too. Oh, and all the teachers should have college degrees. The idea that everybody of any class, race, or gender could go to high school was pure lunacy. Besides, where were you going to find all the college-educated people to teach all those high schools when only 1% of Americans had a college degree? This child is being absurd. And yet, once again, the absurd thing is exactly what happened. Over the next century, between 1870 and 1970, every child in America slowly gained the right to go to a public high school for free. And for the second century in a row, the US led the world in something that was educationally ridiculous. As with primary school, it took longer for public high school to reach poor people and oppressed minorities, but it did eventually get there. Everywhere. Over 20,000 new high schools were built between 1900 and 1940. This caused Americans to spend an average of 14 years in school rather than just 7 in 1900. It caused the percent of Americans with a high school degree to increase from 2% to over 70% in less than a century. If there ever was a period of flagrant overeducation of Americans, It was from 1900 to 1940. What did this ridiculousness cause? Did exploding the number of Americans with elite level educations lead to dangerous levels of educated people in the past? Well, many scholars have now had time to study the effects of giving more and more people access to elite level education. If you want to get a sense for the general consensus, here's something you can do for yourself right now. Pick up an artificially intelligent chatbot like ChatGPT or Perplexity or Gemini and ask it this question. What cultural, economic, and political effects do rapid increases in educational attainment have on a nation? And here are some of the things they might say. Increased economic growth, improved technological innovation, reduced poverty, social and economic equality, a growing middle class, enhanced global competitiveness, improved health outcomes, cultural enrichment and innovation, increased social mobility, peace and stability. These AI chatbots have the ability to quickly scan all the evidence and they can summarize it for you. And at least in this case, they're not wrong. If you think about it, being the best in the world at public education from 1900 to 1940 did make all these things true in the USA for the generations that came immediately after. Economic growth? After the high school movement, economic growth was faster in the US than ever before or since. Technological innovation? The US became the world's tech leader in the 1870s after it had already been the world's most educated country for over a generation, and it remained that way. Reduced poverty? Poverty went down from 60% to about 12% over the 20th century. Social equality? Before the US became educationally ridiculous, it was a slave society where only white men with property could vote. Women had almost no rights. Many African Americans were enslaved. Rising education fueled the various movements that empowered the oppressed and gave them more equal standing in America. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. Economic equality? Yes, actually. While average education levels were still increasing at a ridiculous rate, the US was one of the most economically egalitarian places in the world. During the mid-20th century, wages of women, non-white people, and poor people rose faster than the wages of men, white people, and rich people. The middle class swelled and the rich became less rich in comparison to the average American. Global competitiveness? Yes. Improved health outcomes? Yes, the average lifespan grew a lot in the 20th century. Cultural enrichment and innovation? Think about America in the 20th century and ask yourself if its culture became enriched and innovative and influential in the world. Social mobility? Yes. While education was still seriously improving in the mid-20th century, children stood a very good chance of doing a lot better than their parents. And being born poor or working class did not mean a person was going to live out their whole life that way. Peace and stability? Yes. The period after the 1940s was a time of very low polarization in the United States. The important social movements of that era to liberate the oppressed were at times met with violence. But the larger society was not fracturing and disintegrating like it is today. People still had optimism in institutions and believed in democracy. They didn't hate and despise people just for voting for the opposing party. The effect of ridiculous expansion of elite education does not seem to be a recipe for disaster. So what would happen if we ever gave every single child the most elite education of all? If we tutored them full time? And if it worked as well as the research tells us that it should? Before we come back to this question, there is this little nagging problem. You might be wondering, if expanding elite education is supposedly so great, why doesn't that stuff seem to all be true anymore? Inequality did fall in the 20th century, but it's been rising again since the 1980s. Economic growth has slowed down, social mobility has fallen, average lifespans are actually shrinking. And peace and stability are not how most people are feeling about life in the USA right now. So here's another thing you can do. Go back to that AI bot and ask it, what effect has educational stagnation since the 1980s had on the USA? Or, what effects does long-term educational stagnation have on a country in general? And here's what you will probably find. Reduced economic growth, increased inequality, social unrest, reduced social mobility, reduced health outcomes, rising polarization, decline of democratic norms, and social unrest. Apparently, ridiculous educational progress is not something that you can just do and be done with it. Countries can't just have a moment of ridiculous educational expansion and check the box and call it done. It's a continual need because as societies become more complex, if the educational system does not find a way to become ridiculous again, all those things that were great about the last time education became ridiculous start to disappear. And if you aren't afraid of the effects of long-term educational stagnation on your children and your grandchildren's generation, then you haven't studied the history of educational stagnation. So finally, what would happen if we tutored all the kids and 90% of our children emerged from our schools smarter than the top 20% of us do today? What if the average American became smarter than 98% of Americans are right now? It sounds ridiculous and unprecedented, right? What would we need so many smart people for? But it's not as unprecedented as it sounds. In fact, the average American of the 1990s was smarter than 98% of the Americans of the 1890s. The average IQ rose 30 points over the 20th century. And 30 points above the average just happens to be the 98th percentile. And the 20th century is known to historians today as the American century. Doing things to actually make Americans smarter has never been bad for this country. If there's anything that has historically made the American experiment truly exceptional, it is educational ridiculousness. Radically expanding access to what used to be elite education has been the norm. As the world has become more complex, the USA has historically been the first culture to respond with new educational ridiculousness. And when we did that, these were the outcomes. If we were to grant Kevin's wish to be tutored instead of taught in a classroom, and if we became ridiculous like that for a third time, it would probably just produce the same results as it did the first two times we tried something new and ridiculous. Wages rising, middle class growing, polarization subsiding, inequality shrinking, stability and democratic norms returning, and optimism about the future growing. What's far scarier is trying to imagine what would America be like if it never did anything ridiculous in education ever again. Human power is brain power, and shifting education patterns means shifting power patterns. This channel is devoted to studying education patterns, so we can learn the deeper why behind history and current events, and even future events. Like and subscribe for insights into our world that come from seeing it through the education lens.